state of New York.
Are we ready? All right, excellent. Okay, good evening. I'm Katie Campbell. I'm the executive director of the Golden Ball Tavern Museum, about half a mile down the Boston Post Road. And the Golden Ball Tavern, for those of you who don't know, was the home of Isaac Jones, a loyalist, and his descendants. Isaac and 6 generations of his family lived there until 1963, when it was purchased by Howard Gambrill and a bunch of history enthusiasts, and became a museum. So the Golden Ball is a loyalist tavern, and the Josiah Smith Tavern, where we are right now, was a patriot tavern. And they were 2 of the town's establishments serving the people of Weston in 1775. Both buildings continue to be supported by the town of Weston, I'm delighted to say, and serve as places to steeped in American history. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Joseph Adelman, is a historian of American communication, politics, and media. He will share information on just how important these taverns were and how they serve as hubs for communications in the 1700s. Dr. Adelman is a professor of history at Framingham State University. He also serves as project coordinator of Across America 1776, and he holds a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University. He is also the author of Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing, 1763 to 1789. He has written extensively on news during the Revolution and is currently writing about the history of the post office in America. We are delighted to be hosting Dr. Adelman tonight. Quick housekeeping things. Please keep your questions to the end. Following the lecture, we will have, we'll be serving libations down in the original JST tap room. The Weston Historical Society has graciously opened their doors for you to wander through with your drinks, should you choose to view their current exhibit. And bathrooms are both upstairs and downstairs.
No, not downstairs.
Oh, not downstairs. Excuse me.
Later.
Later. Thank you. Lastly, the Golden Ball is featuring a special exhibit called Spies Among Us, which is the spies in the American Revolution, and we invite you to come and visit. We're open on Thursdays and the second Sunday of every month. And lastly, thank you to the friends of the Josiah Smith Tavern who made this beautiful space available to all of us this evening. And without further ado,
thank you all for coming out on what turned out to be a kind of nasty night. I did something that you would not have done in 1775, which is try to travel from Framingham to Weston in the dark and the rain. Thank goodness for headlights and windshield wipers. I am delighted to be here with you. Was delighted to get the invitation. So thank you to Katie and Deb and Pam and the folks at Weston Media for making all of this possible. I'm happy to talk with you. This is the first time I've been in this particular building, so if you want to ask me questions later, you may have to follow me around through the exhibit while we're down there. But I have been to the Golden Ball. I went last September, so I want to make sure we get a photo of that up. Is it going to show it? There it is. So I came with my kids last September, and they're not pictured because they're behind me somewhere complaining. They actually had a good time. I will say one of the things I love about the Golden Ball, I'm a historian at heart of the American Revolution, but I love that it's got it literally shows the layers of the families and the generations, which is something that's sometimes hard to explain to kids or to my college students or to see. There's one room where there's literally layers of wallpaper that you can go back generation by generation, and that's just a fantastic thing to be able to see, because these houses, these buildings, they never were, but certainly during the time that they were inhabited, were never frozen in time, right? They were always constantly used and being updated and changed. So my goal for tonight is to help contextualize Josiah Smith and Isaac Jones. I have a strong suspicion that I am in the bottom half in terms of knowledge of the Golden Ball Tavern specifically and the Josiah Smith Tavern specifically. So I'm going to try and stay on the broader level, and I'll talk a little bit about Smith and Jones and others, and how their decisions that they were making in 1775 affected things, but really talk about taverns and their role in the information ecosystem of early America. To do that, we're going to go way back, maybe. By the way, I'm not playing on my phone. We ended up with my phone being the best way to do the slides. So, and now I'm not going to touch it again. Okay, so that's New England, and it's from a fantastic book by Kate Grandjean, who teaches it over at Wellesley, so not too far from here also, that shows some of the intercolonial pathways. So in the 17th century, the earliest decades of white English settlement, New England was native space. Weston was largely native space. There are some farms and there's a small town, but if you travel between Weston and Boston even, you have to pass through Nipmuc, Massachusetts. You have to pass through native space to get to Boston. So for travelers, a lot of what they did was by water. There was not a lot of English travel by land in the 17th century. The other reason for that was very practical. There weren't a lot of, horses were plentiful later than we think they were. That there were not that many available to ride around or to travel. So travel was by foot. But if you needed to travel from place to place, and I love showing students this map, state highway system on the dotted lines are all native pathways. So we've got a pathway that runs basically due west to Springfield. I apologize for the resolution. A path that veers south towards Hartford. And so we have I-90 and I-84 and I-95 and Route 6 and Route 3, right? They're all already there in 1600, before the Pilgrims, before John Winthrop, before anything has happened. We've built over what were native pathways. We've taken literally well-worn paths to do this. So if you were traveling in the 17th century, you were trying to do it quickly. You were trying to do it. Relations with Native Americans sometimes were good, sometimes were not good, depending on exactly who and where we're talking about. Often, if you needed to send information from one place to another through the interior, you would do it via a native person. You'd essentially hire a native messenger. And this actually, Kate's book is a lot about this. They know the land better. They're able to travel peaceably between places through native spaces. And they don't read or write English, so it's actually pretty secure to send a message written in English. For the most part, right, the native messengers that are hired, if they don't read English, that they can't possibly, even if they break the seal on a letter, can't do that. Okay, so that's the 17th century. By the 18th century, welcome horses. The population density is increasing, as you might imagine, as you drive town to town and see, right, we're sort of in a region that was where the towns were founded in the mid-17th century, very early on. But the population grows more dense. There are more travelers going for more than just one day's trip in New England between Boston and Springfield, Boston and Hartford. You wouldn't come this way if you're going to Providence, obviously, or down towards Rhode Island. And so we get more movement of people. We also get improvement in the road systems. I updated this, but it didn't update on the version that was on my phone in terms of the order. So we start to get the British actually interested in building a longer distance road system a little bit. So the postal system, which as Katie said is my new project that I'm working on a longer span of American history, but in the colonial era, it gets started by the British in 1710, is when the British actually say, okay, we're going to have a colonial postal system. We're going to build a road. They build two, right, there's two Boston Post roads, one that is right here, and the other that goes down and along the Connecticut coast to New York, and what becomes Route 1. It's largely a system for transmitting commercial messages, for transmitting news. and it's largely along the coast. So it's again an older map, but you can see the main route, primary route, in many places the only route, runs along the coast. What's now US 1 and then US 301 as you're going south. There is a route that eventually in the 1770s that they build north to Albany and then Montreal. And this map doesn't show it, but there is also a route that goes west for the postal system to Springfield.
It's not easy for us to read any of the cities and towns. Could you mention them?
Yes, I'm trying to. So Albany's there-ish, that route north Albany to Montreal. Boston is there. If you can see the little Cape Cod elbow is right there. Sometimes in class I feel like a weatherman. It's raining. That's it. That's what you get. And then Boston heading west, there's the Connecticut River, and so Springfield is right around there-ish. That there is another route that did not appear on this map that was printed in the 1970s, but they really get interested in the postal system in the 1750s during the 7 Years' War, when they build even more roads. That's really, for our purposes, what the postal system is useful for in terms of taverns, is they build roads and build roads that are usable at a longer distance. And a lot of that is thanks to Benjamin Franklin, who becomes Deputy Postmaster General for North America. He does a survey of the entire system early on in his tenure. And taverns sometimes they actually are a post office. We'll talk about that more later. Often they're simply they're a Dropbox location because they're a central location in the town. You could drop off a letter there and it would make sure to be sent off. You could pick it up there. Okay, so by the mid-18th century, 1750s, 60s, we've got a lot more people out on the roads traveling. They've got horses. They need to stop every once in a while, right? To eat, to let their horses rest and eat. To get off the highway, off the road if the road conditions are something other than ideal. 11 months and 15 days out of the year in New England. So we need a system of taverns. There needs to be something. We need rest areas. Okay, so what do we have serving that function is taverns. Now, they end up doing a whole lot more, as I'm sure most of, if not all of you know already. I just wanted to bring it all together. So for travelers and for locals, it can serve as a restaurant, as a coffee shop, coffee house, as a bar, as we will enjoy a little later, as a place for reading the news. You could come together and gather newspapers and sit and talk about the news. Some taverns had works of literature loosely described, but you could sit and read a book. Then also, and this is something that often was required by law, that you had to have a tavern in every town with some sort of overnight accommodation. You then had to have some sort of services, not just for the humans, but for the animals. We don't want to forget about the horses. And then also, as you can tell, this kind of big public meeting space, which get used for all sorts of different things in the 18th century. If you'll pardon me and make sure I look at my list so I don't just riff. In some towns, the court met in the tavern. That was the space. They wouldn't build a separate courthouse. It didn't meet all through the year. It would meet for a week or two at a time. And I don't know, were there court sessions in this room? Do we know? We don't. Okay. There might have been. It's an important space for local farmers, who are a group of people who very specifically can't go very far because they have to be working every single day on their land. So they do serve a lot of really important local functions as a way to get social life, as a way to get news and information, especially out in towns that are not seaports. So they have a variety of names around the colonies. Here they're known as taverns. Occasionally, Wayside Inn is an inn. Sometimes they're called public houses. In Virginia, apparently they were called ordinaries. I don't know quite enough about Virginia other than it's Virginia, to be able to say too much about that and why they picked that name. But it really is, it's it's an all-purpose public space. It's an indoor equivalent in some ways of a town green, although I guess most town greens don't have bars. But if you extrapolate that, it's a very much a public gathering space and a collecting space for the town, and then also for people coming in and through town in a variety of ways. Just to give you a sense of what it was like to travel, I wanted to share a little of maybe John Adams, who wrote in his draft autobiography a little about traveling. So this is very early on in 1757. It would have been just after he had graduated from Harvard College and was reading the law in Worcester. He took a trip down to Rhode Island, and in traveling back, had to stay at inns. It's a multi-day trip to get from Newport to Worcester in 1757. So he wrote, next morning, when he's leaving, I pursued my journey by land to Worcester. The whole journey was accomplished in 4 days, one of which was Sunday. So Newport to Worcester was 4 days. As I was obliged to ride all that day, I had an opportunity observing the manners of Rhode Island, much more gay and social than our Sundays in Massachusetts. I think I see a minister in the room. We can talk about religion and religious toleration in Rhode Island later. At Angels in Providence, I met a relation, I presume a cousin, I don't remember exactly who, and a neighbor, Mr. John Bass, who had lost his parish at Ashford by the intolerance of the times, and he crossed out that other phrase, and had removed his family to Providence and begun the practice of physic. I met another clergyman and a sensible man at Bristol. At the inns, as usual, so he expects this, there were scenes and characters for the amusement of Swift or even Shakespeare. So he is seeing inns and being on the road. I don't know how many of you take road trips and stop, at the Thomas Edison rest area in New Jersey, but it's sort of giving that sort of vibe in an 18th century way of meeting people and interacting. And because you're staying overnight, and you stay overnight with whoever, there's no private accommodations. So you may be sharing a bed. I didn't pull it, but there's a famous story of Adams and Franklin traveling during the Revolutionary War and sharing a bed and having a fight over whether the window should be open. The New Englander, John Adams, had been trained to keep the window closed so you don't catch a cold. And Franklin, the science experimenter par excellence, said, no, you got to have the window open to get fresh air. And so they spend the whole night up and down, and sharing a bed. Because there's only one bed. Okay, so Boston's the big fish, as it has been for quite a long time in Massachusetts, and the debate about whether it should be the big fish is an age-old debate in Massachusetts. But in Massachusetts, it certainly was. It has a very different environment for taverns than almost anywhere else. So first of all, it's a seaport, which means that not only do you have people traveling through by land, you have sailors, you have temporary residents in a way that you don't in Weston or in Framingham or in other towns a little further inland. There are a lot of taverns. In 1765, according to one historian, there were 134 licensed taverns in Boston, which would probably be a lot for today, but that's one for every 123 residents of Boston. And I think that number includes the kids. That's the prevalence of how widespread the taverns are through town. So Boston had enough taverns. Right here we have a Patriot Tavern and a Loyalist Tavern. Boston would have had taverns for all sorts of different kinds of clienteles, for the elite, for the sailors, for people from different parts of Massachusetts or England, and you start to get this social differentiation. So now I am going to share a Franklin quote. I'm a newspaper person, and Franklin is a newspaper guy. So when he first arrives in Philadelphia, he has very little money. He has enough money to buy what he describes as 3 puffy rolls. And he walks down the street eating one and with the other 2 under his arms. Then he finds a Quaker meeting house and immediately falls asleep. Sorry, Reverend. Then he asks somebody where he should stay. And so he says, walking again down towards the river, looking in the faces of the people, I met a young Quaker man whose countenance I liked, and accosting him, requested he would tell me where a stranger could get lodging. We were then near the sign of the Three Mariners. Here, says he, is one place that entertains strangers, but it is not a reputable house. If thee will walk with me, I'll show thee a better. And he brought me to the Crooked Billet in Water Street. So they've got this, right, when you've got lots of taverns, you get this sort of differentiation for all sorts of different rings, for politics, for class orientation, for profession, for, I don't know exactly which ones the sailors would have gone to in Boston, but there would have been sailors' taverns and there would have been locals' taverns in a way that, in the same way that we have various kinds of things like that now. So there's a couple of reasons that they license. In Boston, it's to try and control the number, to keep the number at even as there are a lot, to keep it sort of settled and controlled. There are some concerns about the free flow of alcohol and making sure that that is controlled for social control, religious and moral reasons, for a variety of things. Outside of Boston, the general court, the Massachusetts legislature, the problem is reversed. They actually often force somebody to get a tavern license because you have this system of roads. You need some place for people to stop every 5 or 10 miles. So Weston has to have a tavern. Sudbury has to have a tavern. Marlborough has to have a tavern at least. And those are far east enough that it's not a problem in the 1760s, but you can imagine that there would be some towns that are small enough where they might not have otherwise had them, and the legislature is basically saying, no, you have to open something. Find somebody to take the license and run this. Okay, so we've got all sorts of different things going on in taverns. We've got people moving. We've got locals coming in and out. One of the key functions of it, which is the reason I can come here and feel like an expert, is information circulation. And especially through thinking about the news and the transportation of news. So, maybe. Okay. It changed on here. Oh, just a delay. Okay, so newspapers in early America are critically important sources of information. I had hoped for oh, no, it is almost. I'm going to talk through it, so don't worry too much. Newspapers are really important sources of information, even in places like Weston that don't have a newspaper. So in the colonial era, all of the newspapers are printed in port towns, in part because they're bigger and in part because the interest in news is transatlantic. It is not something where you would be interested in local news. Boston, the biggest town in Massachusetts in the 1770s, is a population of about 15,000 total. Half of those are children. It's a small place. If something's going on in town, you just talk to somebody and you find out. You don't need a newspaper. It is a very small place, and Boston's also a geographically very small place compared to what it is today. So what you're interested in with the newspaper is stuff from other places. So to put together a newspaper is what this slide is the printers in Boston, in Newport, in Providence, in New Haven, and Hartford, are putting together news from a variety of different sources. One of the sources they're using is oral reports. So literally someone will get off the ship, walk in and say, you won't imagine what happened in London 6 weeks ago. Let me tell you this story. And then that goes in the newspaper. They're sharing things from letters. I just read this. My cousin is a merchant in Bristol, and he wrote me this letter. Or my nephew has moved to Philadelphia, and he's working there, and he sent me this information about the protests down in Philadelphia. Why don't you take this paragraph and print it in the newspaper? So they do. And then they're able to take material from other newspapers. So in Weston, you would have had probably the best access to Boston newspapers, but you would have then, by that, gotten access to news from all sorts of other places. My best slides are of a newspaper from Philadelphia, so I apologize in advance for not using a New England example. But this is what the newspaper would have looked like. It was 4 pages, 1 sheet of paper, 2 pages per side of the sheet of paper, fold it once, 4 pages once a week. Each page roughly 11 by 17, give or take, depending on the exact size. The paper wasn't standardized in size, but that's roughly, so this that you're looking at would have been like 4 8.5 by 11 regular letter size sheets of paper if you'd folded it twice in terms of the size. About 10,000 characters per page, set by hand. Every letter, every space, every punctuation mark, every of these lines, these other indications, everything set by hand in the printing office. There's a reason why they only did it once a week. It took them a while. And this, you would come to the tavern and you read the newspaper, and one of the things I always love talking about is they're organized very differently from newspapers today. Newspapers today are organized by importance of the story, right? There's an editor who says this is the top of page 1 story, above page 1 above the fold, and it's organized by topic. There's a sports section, there's a business section, there's a classified section. This isn't organized by that way because it's only these 4 pages once a week. Actually, you can see the way information travels. So in Philadelphia, in this example from 1763, this is the back page, page 4. It's hard to read here because of the resolution, but so that's such is life. You'll have to just trust me that all of these are advertisements. A huge proportion of a successful newspaper is advertising, and actually a bunch of the first page is advertising. So this is the stuff you can do early in the week. He publishes, William Bradford does, on Thursdays. So the previous Thursday or Friday, he can work on getting these pages set up and run through the press. And then you have to let them dry. By the way, they're printed slightly damp. If you've never seen a colonial printing demonstration, the paper is slightly damp so the ink doesn't bleed when you do the imprint. So you have to let it dry. Then you flip it over, re-dampen it. Did I get the next page? Yep, there we go. And you get the inside pages. So Bradford and his crew, his staff of journeymen and apprentices, then spend time setting all this other type. There's even more advertising. And then there's news, and the news comes from different places, and you actually can see you get slowly and slowly closer to Philadelphia. In this example, the Philadelphia News is that, which is less than usual, but gives you a sense of the scale. This is news from, I think that's Savannah, Georgia. I'm at bifocals age. I can't do this anymore either. New York, Boston, more New York. Right? It's all news from other places. And the idea is when you come to a tavern, you get this once a week. Yes, the type is really small, but the reading practices are very social. It is not, I mean, we do see this in Starbucks and McDonald's, right? You go in on a week, or Dunkin', right? You go in on a weekday morning and there might be people sitting around in a corner with a newspaper. Like, that was what the tavern was people sitting around and reading stories and talking about it, much more than somebody sitting at their breakfast table with a cup of coffee very quietly reading by themselves, right? The philosophy of it was that you would work your way through this, and so it's organized not by importance at all. I have an example of that I show students of one of the first versions of the Declaration that was printed in Virginia, and they have trouble finding it because it's just in the middle of page 2. Because that's when the news arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia, so that's when they set the type. It's not on the front page, it's not, and it's the right? What more important news is there in the 18th century? Okay, so people in Weston would have been reading Boston newspapers. Okay, back to taverns. I'm going to assume that was for news gathering and information sharing and not any of the other things up on the... Okay, so in 1770, according to David Conroy, who wrote a great book about Massachusetts public houses and taverns, in Middlesex County, where Weston and Framingham are, 231 public houses in 1770. Yeah. Okay, so drinking is very popular, but drinking becomes a point of contention in the revolutionary imperial debates for a couple of reasons. One, is this produced locally? No. Ales, ciders, right? Those are the things that are produced locally. By the 1760s and 70s, rum and other distilled spirits, but especially rum, are very popular. Rum is made from a byproduct of sugar, which means it comes from the Caribbean, from the West Indies. So it is a sign of luxury, of commercialism, of the British Empire to be consuming rum. Even though people are drinking a lot of it. So you then get debates about drunkenness and dissipation and its relationship to civic virtue. How can you be a good citizen if you're drunk? How can you be a good citizen and defend your country if you're drinking Jamaican rum and not good Massachusetts cider? Taverns then also are important again. They're meeting places. So a lot of the taverns in the colonial era, become important meeting places for town meetings, for various protest meetings. There's the Sons of Liberty in Boston go through a series of taverns, the most famous of which is the Green Dragon, which there is a Green Dragon right along the Freedom Trail in Boston. I think it's not the original site. It's not the same one, but they claim the lineage because marketing. Okay, and then also all of this news gathering and information sharing ratchets up in importance once you get into the imperial crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. Okay, now let's talk about Weston and the Revolution. Okay, except I'm going to talk about Boston for just one more second. Because in November of 1772, the Boston Town Meeting created a committee of correspondence. A committee of correspondence is a very standard thing. Lots of legislative bodies have them. Somebody has to write the letters, and so you form a committee that's in charge of writing the letters back and forth to other legislatures, to other governments, et cetera, et cetera. The Boston Town Meeting creates one specifically to protest a decision by Governor Hutchinson in Boston to allow the judges to be paid from the imperial treasury rather than by the General Court of Massachusetts. Which would mean, according to their logic, that the judges would no longer be independent, but would instead be dependent on the king and crown for their salary and therefore be biased against Massachusetts colonists. So they write to every single town in Massachusetts. And towns write back. And thankfully, a 19th century historian collected them. Of course, he took the records to New York, and so the actual records, this is a little bit of a story of them writing in the newspaper, writing out to the towns, and starting to receive responses. What I wanted to get to was Weston responding. It took them 6 months. Towns responded. Some towns responded quickly, the ones that were super linked in and connected. Plymouth is one of the first to respond. There are lots of, so James Warren, right? There's colonial leaders you would have heard of who are living in Plymouth who are really connected into Boston through a variety of marriages and business connections. Plymouth is, they write back within 2 weeks. A bunch of the towns out this way, it takes a lot longer. These records, as I said, are at the New York Public Library. So if you search Boston Committee Correspondence in the New York Public Library, they've digitized this whole collection. So you can go, they did it very recently. So if you look on your own computer, the scans are beautiful and very clear. But this is the letter that the Westonians wrote in response. And fortunately, I picked just a quote from here to give you a sense of their response. And one of the signers, by the way, was Mr. Josiah Smith, highlighted in red there, with a number of others. And one of the things they say in this letter is, I didn't put it here, so I got to look here. As the fate of America at present seems so much to depend on the wisdom of her councils and the union of her colonies, we heartily rejoice to hear the representative bodies of so many governments on this continent are uniting to support her common cause. May heaven direct their counsels and bless their endeavors for this end. Huzzay! Effusive, yes, very pro-patriot. Not unanimous in Weston or any other town, as we know. And they're getting this from the Boston newspapers, of which there are 5 printing in the early 1770s. None of them would have described themselves this way. This is me putting labels on them. They all would have described themselves as operating a free and open press. Open to all, influenced by none was a sort of running motto for basically all newspapers. It wasn't true. Or it was a strategy, but they were very clearly marked papers that were leaning one way or the other that would have been in the rooms in this building and down the street at the Golden Ball. So patriot-leaning papers, you knew this. The Boston Gazette and Country Journal, I didn't add that because the type would have gotten smaller, published by Benjamin Eads and John Gill. Benjamin Eads is actually one of the founders of the Sons of Liberty in Boston. So he's central, he's right in there. The Massachusetts Spy, which is published by Isaiah Thomas. If any of you have heard of the American Antiquarian Society, he, right around Lexington and Concord, he leaves Boston for Worcester and later is the founder of the Antiquarian Society. So in the 1770s, he's a young, brash, pro-patriot printer in his early 20s. We have 2 papers that are very clearly loyalist. They are very much dependent on government patronage, and their news looks a lot different. So we have, I'm forgetting their first names. I think it's Nathaniel Mills and John Hicks. When in doubt, guess John. Published the Boston Postboy and Advertiser, and you can see Margaret Draper, yes, a woman printer, also publishes, they for a time published together as the Massachusetts Gazette, but she published the Boston Newsletter. They are publishing papers, but they're really dependent on government printing contracts to stay afloat. They're not all that popular in Boston. There are loyalists, but they're not as many as you might think. And then there's one that just still is sort of trying to ride the wave in the middle, the Boston Evening Post, to the extent that they're able to. So you come and you read these different accounts. You're reading, I'm assuming that Smith would have been more partial to having people read and talk about the Gazette and the Spy than the Gazette and the Gazette. Then the Boston Postboy and the Boston Newsletter, and down the street would have been the reverse. But they might have read all of them. One of the things I found most fascinating about the newspapers is they do reprint each other's works. There is more cross-pollination, and there's not as much of a sense of, I only read this paper. I am only a Boston Herald guy. I am only a Boston Globe guy. Like that doesn't, there's much more of a sense of reading. And some of that is simply because a lot of the news isn't partisan, and it only comes in once every couple of days. So on Monday, I'm forgetting which one publishes which day, but right, if you read the Spy on Monday, by Thursday you've got different news when the Gazette comes in, right? That you kind of need all of these. Okay, so after the Boston Tea Party, in December of 1773, the Parliament responds from Britain with what are collectively become known as, actually much later, the Intolerable Acts. There are 4 of them. Sometimes people add in the Quebec Act. It wasn't about Boston, but it gave Catholics political rights, and people in Boston didn't like that. And so they saw that as part of this. But there's the Boston Port Act, which is the most famous, closes the port of Boston as of June 1st until you pay back 10,000 pounds for the tea you dumped in the harbor. Without doing the math, that's a lot in 1773. The Quartering Act, which allows the British to place soldiers in homes much more readily than in the past. The Imperial Administration of Justice Act, which furthers that issue with judges. It now says, if we don't think we can give you a fair trial here, we'll ship you to Halifax. Yeah, there's punishment, and then there's punishment. And the Massachusetts Government Act, which cancels the Massachusetts Colonial Charter, which had been in place since 1691, and replaces it with a military governor, General Thomas Gage. Okay, people don't like this, to be quite clear. The great thing about being able to talk freely is that, okay, so people in Boston and nearby thought that this was awful, horrible. In the Boston Gazette, they resort to biblical imagery. So in this story from June 6th, just after "Tell it in Gath, publish it in Ascalon, that the Boston Port Bill in all its parts is now carrying into execution," they make reference to the second book of Samuel to declare that the town was more insulted by an English armament than it ever had been by French or Spanish forces. People recreate the join or die image that Benjamin Franklin had actually created 20 years earlier, the snake that was sliced up, and start putting that. After this moment, the British Empire does not have functional control in any part of Massachusetts except where they have soldiers. So by the fall of 1774, the British don't really have any day-to-day authority here. They have authority in Boston, where they're headquartered and where they're garrisoned and where the soldiers are stationed. You get past Boston Neck, and they do not have functional control of what's going on. So Isaac Jones is a little bit in enemy territory, even at that point before shots had been fired. If there is not war, they still consider themselves a colony. They would all probably, to a man, woman, and child, say that they were loyal subjects of George III, but they are not loyal to, that way. They're not loyal to General Gage. They are not loyal to the British soldiers in Boston. And Gage can't really do anything. It's that way? Yeah. It's dark. And I got turned around in the parking lot. I mean, maybe that was the problem, that they went... Okay, as you know, and as I haven't been to the exhibit yet, but if you should go see the Spies Among Us, that's what it's called, right? That's the name of it. About the February 1775 trip from Boston of two spies who stopped at the Golden Ball and then went on to Framingham. There's a Framingham version of this talk since I live there. This is the pamphlet. It actually was published later as Patriot Propaganda. It's published by John Gill of the Eads and Gill of the Boston Gazette in 1779. So later and on in the war, it's sort of taken and published that way. Oop, there we go. I didn't. Okay, so this is where they show up in Weston. Some of you may already be familiar with this text. "Next morning, we set off for Weston. Had a very agreeable day, having fine weather and a beautiful country to travel through. We met nothing extraordinary on the road, nobody knew us, and we were asked very few questions. On our arrival at Mr. Jones's, we were met with a very welcome reception, he being our friend. We received several hints from the family not to attempt to go any more into the country, but as we had succeeded so well heretofore, we were resolved to go the Sudbury Road, which was the main road that led to Worcester, and go as far as the 37 milestone, where we had left the main road, and take the Framingham Road. We slept at Jones's that night and got all our sketches together and sent them to Boston with our man, so that if they did stop and search us, they would not get our papers." They continue on to Framingham, where I think they were sort of figured out who they were. They watch a militia muster and demonstration in Framingham. They go to Worcester. They're trying to gather information. But the reason why all of that is happening, the sort of connecting piece, is because of the Port Act and because of the Government Act, and because of the fact that military government is hard to implement on people who don't want it. He has to send spies out. The reason he's sending spies out is that he doesn't have control out here. He can't ask the Board of Selectmen to send a report back. He can't ask and much of anybody to do anything out here, even the ones who are loyal to him, who might be loyal to him, or loyalists, loyal to the British Crown. Okay, as you know, we're winding down, hopefully in a good time. Yes, just 7-8 weeks later after they're coming through here, Gage, using information that he's been gathering from some of these spies, decides to try to take the weapons that colonists have been gathering in Concord to finally arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams. And I say it that way, and they're like, I cannot believe they waited that long from their perspective to even try to arrest them. But they have intelligence that Samuel Adams and Hancock are in Lexington, which they were, to try and arrest the two of them. All of these printers, the Loyalists stay put. The Patriot printers all leave. This is when Isaiah Thomas goes to Worcester and never comes back. Eads and Gill leave and go to Watertown. There are a couple of the printers. I think the fleets escape too, but Draper stays as well, and then she goes with the British to England when they evacuate Boston. But on the night of April 18th, as the British troops are mustering in Boston and traveling, and Paul Revere heads out this way, and William Dawes, where does everybody gather? The taverns, right? At the, I have to be careful about which one is which in Lexington. The Minutemen gathered at the Buckman Tavern, right by the Green. That and the Monroe Tavern sort of collapsed in my brain as to which one was which. The British end up like regrouping at some point later in the day at Monroe Tavern in Lexington on the Minuteman Trail. This is where the news would have come of all of that. And during the day, what ends up happening, please, thank you. So there's a famous letter that's known as the Lexington Alarm. There's a couple of copies of it. The first one I saw was actually in Philadelphia at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So that's a copy that made it all the way to Philadelphia. This one is over in Lexington at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum. They have a better digital copy, and they have a better digital copy for presentations. So this letter was written at about 10 a.m. by Joseph Palmer in Watertown. And it was basically like, it's actually really interesting because it's so unpropagandized. It's so right in the middle of things that it's the fog of war, right? That little bit of like, we don't know what's going on. We know they marched. We know there was shooting in Lexington. We think they're headed to Concord. Like, sound the alarm. And then that traveled. And each of these spots, it went into the town and was signed by representatives of the town. So the version I've seen in Philadelphia has like extra pages tacked on at the end because people would say, we signed it in Branford, Connecticut at noon on Friday, April 21st. And you can watch it go and get to Philadelphia. Yes. For somebody who's interested in the circulation of information, this was one of those like, yay, moments in the archive. This is a table from my book, from Revolutionary Networks, that I put together with this information. And you can see, and I will simply say, I think the technical term is bananas fast. To get to, it would not usually take 5 days to get to Philadelphia. It would take 2 weeks, maybe even longer, depending on exactly how fast you were traveling. After the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere did it in 8. And this is 5. Night and day. You can see there's some unknown. 11, 4, 7 p.m., 1 a.m., 4 a.m., 7 a.m., 2 a.m. in New Brunswick, New Jersey, right? Like they are riding through the night. In this case, they're probably changing horses. They have a network built up. The taverns are helping them because right? That's where you have the kinds of supplies built up. And then I will show you, because I'm a newspaper person, that you can then also watch the news follow behind the physical letter in the newspapers. A couple days behind in Norwich, Connecticut, which is just outside New London, New York, Philadelphia, Lancaster, Baltimore, eventually down to Williams. So it takes, but again, it usually takes a month to get news from Boston to Williamsburg. This is 10 days later that it's in the newspaper in Williamsburg, in both Virginia Gazettes. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but all the newspapers in Williamsburg were called the Virginia Gazette. So that news is traveling. Okay, well, I'll wait just a second to get to that. No, we're going to stay there. I'm about at the end. So in the promotional blurb, I think I put some sort of probably too clever by half line about the revolution didn't start in a tavern, but it had to stop there for a snack. Right, and that's kind of what I want to have as our message for today, is that the tavern is a super important site. It's a place For locals and for travelers, it's a place where news and information and people and horses are all gathering and working as nodes in an information network, and becoming partisan and political and working. So it's wonderful that we have sites like the Josiah Smith Tavern. I'm not even going to try to point to the Golden Ball Tavern because I'll end up pointing to Jupiter or something. But we need to remember that taverns are these important spaces, and that really critical, really central to information. Thank you. I'll leave up my book cover, and if you're interested in contacting me, you're welcome to get in touch. And we have a few minutes for Q&A, yes?
Yes.
Pre-libation? In terms of carriages and...
Where you would just be a passenger.
Yes, probably 1750s, 1760s. There are... so Adams in 1757, that autobiography entry, he's a young, poor guy studying the law, so he's just on him and a horse. But yeah, when they ride to the Continental Congress, they're in a carriage. So that's, I don't know exactly when, but in that sort of 1750s, 60s, what we call late colonial era. And then there's regular stagecoach routes, New York to Philadelphia in the 1770s, Boston to New York by the 1780s, maybe a little before that, but definitely the war gets in the way of that a little bit, but definitely by the 1780s. Other questions? I don't know that for sure. I'd be surprised if there wasn't here, given its patriot leanings, and that you have to muster somewhere, and this is either this or the church is the public meeting space for the town, for most towns. There's just not that many big public spaces in 1775. But I don't know specifically about the history of Josiah Smith. I'm sort of looking around desperately for someone who works here. Both.
Okay.
So the easiest, if you're in Boston, some of the apprentices would literally walk around town with subscribers' papers. Out here in a place like Weston, Smith and Jones would have kept up subscriptions to newspapers for people to come and get in the tavern. So they would have been subscribers, and then depending on exactly who in town was interested in it, they would have subscribed on their own as well. But especially a little further out here, it would have required paying the postage to get the newspaper, which is relatively expensive. So sending an individual newspaper from one printer to another is free. Isaiah Thomas could send a newspaper to New York to his printer buddy in New York, one copy, for free as a way to build up all this news. The British had that, and the Americans, the US postal system in its earliest iterations, absorbed that model of we are an information system, and so we're going to support that. Individual subscriber, that's expensive. It's a lot of paper to carry. It's heavy once you carry 100 of them, and bulky. So in that era, postage is actually determined by a combination of how much paper you're sending and how far. So I'm guessing that most people in Weston would have just come here to read it, or to the Golden Ball, or if there were other taverns, right? Yes, sir.
I'm curious how the British Army and the taverns interacted when they moved, inland. Did the British Army suspect most of the taverns were patriots, and therefore, there was arrests, and then also on the tavern side, would they report troop movements to the rebels? Like, what was that interaction?
So in terms of when the British come out into the countryside, when that happens is really April 19th, 1775, and that's about it. So there's not a lot of the British Army does not spend a lot of time out in Middlesex County in general. Just the spy, right? It's a couple of individual spies who are trying to cloak themselves in some way, shape, or form. I would note that the accent would not have been as hard as we think it would be, because the accents were all different, and B, the people who lived around here most likely spoke something that was much closer to the accent of the soldiers than the difference now between somebody from Weston now and your average British soldier in terms of the accent. But there were ways in which they were right to be suspicious of just about everybody, and they were a little bit paranoid. So the sort of impetus of your question is, were they just suspicious of everybody? And yeah, they kind of were, unless they knew for sure. Clearly they had information that Isaac Jones was going to give them a good reception, that they knew to make a beeline for that tavern and not this one. So they had information on individual basis and individual tavern owners and tavern keepers. But in terms of when they were actually out here, it really only is that they hang out in Boston a lot.
And you had Margaret Campbell, who was feeding the information.
Yes, Margaret Campbell, who is Thomas Gage's wife,
She
who's
was American.
American from New Jersey. Sorry, I grew up in New York, so if I just sort of automatically say New Jersey derisively, even when I don't mean to. Oh, she's from No, she's not from New York. She can't be. Well, in my mind, she'll still be from New Jersey. But yes, she is American colonial-born. Gage's wife has a portrait done by Copley.
Went back to England and lives at Burl House.
She went back to. They both went back to England because Gage survives. Not anymore, but. Other questions?
I don't think their marriage lasted either. No.
Yes, sir.
Talk about the mail in taverns. Is there any truth to the story that the term post comes from the practice of putting letters that were deposited in a tavern up on a post where they could be collected?
Oh gosh, that's one of those stories that is, it may be true and is also apocryphal and is legend, right? Like it's, I don't know if we have like a story of why a post office is called a post office, but yes, that is one of the origin stories.
At this period of time, was there an industry around ink and paper and lead type, or did it all come from England?
That is a fantastic question. I'll take those each in turn. Until after the Revolution, almost 100% of type is produced in England. There are some very early attempts, Franklin is one of the ones who tries this, to set up and construct a type foundry in colonial America, but that really doesn't happen until the 1780s when we get a real type foundry in what's by then the United States. So if you're setting up shop as a printer, your most likely bet is to buy used type from somebody else. But if you're buying new type, it's coming from Europe, probably London. Ink, you get the ingredients from elsewhere, but it's put together locally. Right, there's a chemical mix that you make. You're making it locally in the printing shop as you need it, but you need to be buying the ingredients. Paper is produced in colonial America. Almost every printer is involved, if they last long enough, in trying to be involved with a paper mill. Paper is a relatively precious commodity. In the 18th century, I sort of wish I'd brought an example, was made of rag linen. Not cotton, there's very little cotton clothing, and not of wood pulp. That shift happens in like the 1830s, 1840s-ish. So that means that paper is relatively precious because it's more expensive the raw material is more expensive and it's more expensive to produce. It does mean it's more durable. So as somebody who's been in archives, the 1750s newspapers are in better shape than the 1850s newspapers, because they're printed on linen paper instead of on wood pulp paper, and it just lasts better. So there is some paper made in colonial America. They're not as good at it, so if you want nice paper, you send off to England. During the Stamp Act, you're supposed to buy your paper from England pre-stamped if you can. So there's all debates about that and where it gets made. So there's some made in America. The higher quality stuff is made in Europe in terms of paper. Yes, ma'am.
What percentage of the area population could read?
In New England, most. One of the hallmarks of New England and of the lineage of Puritan culture, one of the key points of Puritan theology and philosophy is reading the Bible.
So even enslaved people.
Well, in New England, there aren't all that many of those. The rate is much lower for enslaved people in general. In New England, it would be a little higher simply because of the kinds of jobs that enslaved people worked when they were in slavery in New England. There was much more personal service, or if you were enslaved in Weston or right town out here, you'd be working on a farm, but you'd be doing all the things. Right? It's not the picture we have in our head of a cotton plantation where you're specifically just working in the field 12 hours a day, 365. You'd be doing all sorts of different work tasks. And so be a little more likely than an enslaved person in Virginia or South Carolina to be able to read. But the rate is lower for enslaved people. But for women, it's relatively high in New England. And it's because Bible reading was so central to the religious philosophy of the Puritans aren't as influential in Massachusetts in 1770 as they were in 1670, but the sort of the lineage of that, of schooling and making sure. Now, there's a difference between reading and writing. There are more people who can read than who can write. And numeracy, right, being able to keep your numbers is a separate skill. So there are many people, and this is probably more true for women, who could read and tabulate numbers but could not write in an extensive way, or maybe could only write their own names.
The women would have to if they took over the tavern.
But women often, and yes, but this is the
Husband was killed.
well, not even killed. That often women were involved in running the businesses.
All of them was.
All of these print shops, the women were involved in the businesses. They were, I mean, from things that we would consider 18th century feminine activities, but they had like 4 or 5 teenage boys in their house. The apprentices live with them, and you're responsible for feeding and clothing them. So they're running a dorm, at a minimum. They're running a dormitory for a bunch of teenage boys who've just moved away from their parents. I've got a 15-year-old. Please, let's go downstairs before we have that conversation. Right, and then they're also often involved in the shops. Often it's the wife of the master printer, that is, who's keeping the books, who's they didn't have tills or cash registers, right? But who's behind the counter, sort of managing sales and things like that. I pointed out the Boston Newsletter is published by Margaret Draper. She was a widow of Richard Draper, who had been the printer. When he died, she just took over and kept going. And the only reason she stopped was she was a loyalist and she evacuated with the British when they left Boston. So right, so yeah, women are really active. In farming communities, it's a little different just because of the kinds of things people are doing every day. But to get back to your original question, literacy is, New England may be one of the most literate places in the world in the 18th century because everybody's taught to read the Bible. Thank you. Thank you all for having me.
I want to thank Dr. Adelman because it was a really, really great talk.